Sit with me by the low fire. Close your eyes if you like, or let them rest on the wavering light as it plays across the wooden beams. Outside, a thin wind carries salt and cold from the fjord. Inside, the air smells of peat and drying fish, of wool warmed by bodies and the slow, steady breath of a home that has known many seasons. Take a breath. Feel the weight of your cloak, the softness of the fur against your shoulder. Imagine the longhouse settled around you. Benches where people have sat for years, wooden cups darkened by hands, ropes of garlic and herbs hanging from rafters. Let the small familiar noises settle. The occasional creak, the murmur of some distant voice, the steady pop of the fire. Tonight, I want to take a quieter road through history. We have all seen the picture. Broad-shouldered figures with axes glinting, longships cutting through gray seas, banners snapping in wind. Those scenes are true in part, but they are only part of the story. There are other lives tucked in corners of those same images. Lives where the hearts quietly held affections mattered as much as any raid or trade. There are loves that were whispered beside the hearth, partnerships that kept households going, friendships that ran as deep as kin. This evening I will ask you to notice those softer things, to listen for the small notes that have been easy to overlook. We will gently explore a subject both ancient and surprisingly modern. How people in Viking times understood love and desire between people of the same sex. It is a topic often simplified by later storytellers, or ignored by those who prefer the louder tales. We will read between the lines of sagas, listen to what old laws whispered, and imagine what life felt like in the dim corners of a longhouse. We will be careful with our words, and kind in our curiosity. History does not always hand us tidy answers, but it offers pieces, poems, laws, jokes, and the silences between them, and from those pieces we can try to shape a respectful picture. I will tell you what the sources say. The sagas and skalds, the law codes, the odd comment preserved by travelers. I will also tell you what the sources do not say, the silences where women's lives and tender friendships often sleep. Most importantly, I will try to imagine the people who lived those lives without turning them into caricatures or legends. We will think about what it meant to be called unmanly or shameful, and what those accusations reveal about honor and power. We will wonder gently about how desire and affection might have been expressed when speech was limited by custom and reputation. Listen for the small details. Picture the light on someone's hair as they lean close to stitch a seam, the hush of two voices swapping stories after supper, a hand lingering a little longer on a shoulder than custom demands. Imagine the comfort of a shared bed in a storm, the secret laughter over a joke only the two of them understand. These little things are not proof in the way a law book can be proof, but they are human proof. Sensations and scenes that help us imagine what it felt like to love, to desire, to choose a companion in a world where family and reputation mattered so much. We must remember the danger of forcing our own modern words into older lives. Terms like gay or lesbian do not map neatly onto the past. Yet emotional truth is timeless. Affection, longing, and companionship cross centuries. So we will balance caution with empathy. We will not claim to know every intimate detail. We will offer possibilities shaped by evidence and by imagination, because taking people seriously compels us to try. If you enjoy this quieter path into history, if you find yourself soothed by the small, honest stories we will tell, please take a moment to subscribe. Share a thought in the comments if a particular saga or question makes you curious. Your quiet company matters. It shapes which silences we listen to next. For now, breathe again. Feel the warmth of the hearth, and let the longhouse name itself in your mind. Smoke, laughter, clothes drying, the soft murmur of lives linked. We begin with a single story, and then another, until a quiet chorus rises from what once was rumor. Tonight, settle in, take a breath, and imagine stepping back 1,000 years. Let the longhouse close around you like a second skin. Let the wind set the slow rhythm for the tales ahead. Soon we will move through voices, the skald's remembered line, a brusque law carved in ash, the soft, unnamed memories shared by neighbors. We will keep a slow pace. Picture the small gestures of daily life, the warmth of a hand across a bench, the hush of a late sewing circle, the brief, knowing smile in the dark. We will be careful with our words, balancing evidence with imagination. If a passage feels heavy, you can let it rest. You are safe here. When you are ready, we will turn the page and listen to the sagas, the old storytellers who left us the faintest footprints of feeling. For now, breathe, feel the hearth's warmth, and let the house and its people come gently into view. We begin with a single whisper. Sit with me a little longer and listen to the old storytellers. The sagas are a firelight mirror. They throw back a bright, sometimes distorted reflection of people who lived by oath and reputation. When a skald sings or a saga narrator draws out a quarrel, they are not only telling us who fought or who married whom. They are telling us what stung, what pleased, and what threatened a person standing in their community. In those echoes, we sometimes find quiet traces of affection and desire that do not fit the tidy boxes we use today. Viking stories place enormous weight on reputation and the appearance of strength. A man's courage on the battlefield mattered, but so did the way he took a joke, the way he sat at table, the way he slept. Insults could be deadly currency. To call someone names implying weakness or effeminacy was, in that world, to chip away at their ability to command respect. Words like the Old Norse terms loosely translated as unmanly or shameful appear when a narrator wishes to wound a reputation. Those phrases are not gentle. They are weapons shaped from custom. And yet the sagas also show tenderness. Quiet scenes where people sit close, exchange stories, and share burdens. Sometimes what reads as friendship to our ears may have carried other shades of feeling for those who lived it. Leaning in closer during a storm, keeping vigil beside a dying companion, a hand that lingers to steady a boat at night. The sagas rarely spell out private desire the way a modern diary might, but they do not categorically deny that such feelings existed. They frame relationships within the language of honor, power, and social risk. There are moments where accusations of sexual shame appear as blunt political devices. A leader might be called soft or passive to undermine authority. A rival might suggest improper closeness to strip away honor. In that climate, being labeled the passive partner could be far more than insult. It could end a leader's ability to hold alliances, collect fines, or command loyalty. Such charges targeted the public face, how one was seen, and made shaming an effective weapon in assemblies, in verse, and across the floor of a hall during a feast. But do not let me leave the impression that shame defines every bond. The sagas show intimacy and desire entwined with power in gentle and violent ways. A chieftain might openly favor a trusted companion to demonstrate loyalty. A young person might attach to an elder as patron and teacher. Where we see mentorship, apprenticeship, or sworn brotherhood, we should ask how much of it was practical and how much contained tender colors of love. The texts rarely answer directly. Context, tone, and a narrator's intention shape what is recorded. Listen to the way saga narration uses silence. These stories are full of elliptical remarks and abrupt transitions that feel like edges left uncut. Those are precious places for the imagination. A single line noting that one slept in another's bed and then moving on without comment invites wonder. Was it acceptance? A detail a narrator assumed irrelevant? Or a hint of a story best kept from the public record? Such silences are not failures of the source. They are invitations to thoughtful, cautious imagination bounded by evidence. We should also notice how irony and humor shape character. Skaldic verse and saga dialogue sometimes mock someone not only for private loves but for failing to meet an ideal of self-control. That mockery reveals anxieties about autonomy, about crossing lines between public and private life, about how the body could be read as a statement of character. In those jokes, the storyteller teaches listeners what will earn laughter or scorn at the next feast. The lesson is rarely only about sex. It is about who may claim honor and who may be denied it. As you listen, ask yourself this. When you hear a tale, do you listen to what is said, or to what is left unsaid? That question matters because the sagas teach us through omission as much as through detail. They show us what a culture feared, what it prized, and how communities negotiated the space between private feeling and public reputation. Paying attention to both lines and gaps helps us see daily life in its full, complicated texture, mismatched to our modern categories, but rich with human feeling. If a particular saga calls to you, leave a note in the comments. Tell me which old tale you would like explored more closely, and we can sit with it in another episode. I will read selected lines, compare them with legal fragments and household scenes, and together we will try to piece a fuller picture without forcing modern labels where they do not belong. Now picture a hall at dusk. The long benches are rough, but you are warm. Ale breathes softly around a small circle as men and women recite a verse. Two of them trade a look that lasts a fraction longer than a greeting. The narrator moves on to a fight or a marriage, leaving that look unremarked. In the hush that follows, your mind supplies 1,000 human details. The comfort of a shared secret, the careful balance between courage and closeness, the weight of a whisper that could unravel a reputation. These are the currents we will follow, never claiming to name all of them, but listening carefully to their flow. We will take our time, lingering on small gestures. An exchanged cloak, a quiet blessing, a seam stitched by lamplight, because these modest acts are often where the deepest truths of ordinary lives quietly gather and remain. The sagas are not love stories written in the language we now expect, and yet they contain small, honest things that bend toward the heart. Keep your ears open for both the spoken lines and the hushes between them. Let your curiosity be gentle as we move forward. I learned early that laws have a voice of their own, a dry, public voice that names wrongs and sets fines, but which rarely speaks of the small, private griefs that follow a punishment. Imagine an outdoor assembly in late autumn, the place rhymed with frost, flags stilled by wind. People stand in rings in silence. Chiefs speak, witnesses step forward, and rules are read as if the community were a book. These are the places where honor is carved and repaired. The law codes that survive from Norse societies, fragments collected, copied, and translated across centuries, read like careful instructions for keeping a fragile social order. They concern property, marriage, inheritance, and the means to settle blood feuds. They also include sharp words about behavior that threatens a man's standing. One of those words, which we still feel the weight of when we hear it, is urgi. It is a Norse term used to describe what law and custom regarded as shameful effeminacy or passive sexual conduct linked to weakness. Urgi appears in laws and sagas as an insult that cuts to the heart of social power. In a culture where leadership depends on visible strength, on the ability to carry a spear and to meet insult without dropping your temper, being accused of urgi attacked the very currency of authority. The law uses such language as a tool. Sometimes it prescribes fines or requires a public apology. Other times it simply records that a man was shamed. The legal code is less a simple manual of punishment than a map of anxieties. We might imagine, then, a deed and its public consequence. A man accused of passive sex might be compelled to pay a fine, publicly apologize, or suffer a loss of honor that follows him in assembly and saga. But the law's presence does not necessarily mean constant, uniform enforcement. Laws often act as ideals, standards to which a society aspires and warnings about behavior that draws communal censure. Enforcement could be inconsistent, shaped by local power, kinship, and the practical needs of survival. Reading the code, one senses that the law's loudest aim is to regulate reputation as much as bodies. It sketches boundaries: behave this way in public and your claim to honor remains intact. Cross that line and neighbors may refuse you the right to sit at their table. The legal words about urgi and shameful acts are part of that project. They are designed to make certain behaviors publicly risky, so people will shape actions to preserve the communal fabric. Yet fabric is woven of many threads beyond laws. What also matters is how the law talks about women and same-sex behavior. Many preserved codes concern male reputation in explicit terms. They more often speak about men who fail to meet masculine ideals than about women who loved women. That absence can be telling. Sometimes what is unregulated indicates a space where behavior escaped official scrutiny, or where it was invisible to lawmakers who were mostly men. It does not mean such loves did not exist. It means some desires were less visible to rulers. We should ask, too, whether the laws reflect moral absolutism or a practical effort to prevent disorder. There are provisions that seem moralistic, but many rules are pragmatic. They prevent vendettas, clarify inheritance, or deter disruptions at assemblies. Calling someone urgy in public could be a political move, intended to remove a rival's support rather than to reform a private inclination. In that sense, the law is a stage for power plays as much as a ledger of morality. Think of the anxious geometry of a longhouse community. Neighbors depend on each other for food, shelter, and defense. A law that could exile or dishonor a man might destabilize alliances and household survival. So local leaders sometimes tempered punishments to preserve practical bonds. This creates a picture in which written codes and everyday realities have a complicated relationship. The law is an instrument people use, not always the hammer that falls. Listening to the dry sentences of old law texts, my compassion goes to the people whose names the law does not record with tenderness. The law can name a crime, but it cannot name the comfort two people shared when wind howled outside and their children slept. It cannot measure the warmth of a hand in the dark or the solace of a companion who knows your worries. When the law pronounces a fine, it often misses the whole human story folded around that verdict. The laws tell one story, but life is richer than rules written on parchment. I invite you to think about this. Do laws ever match the messy realities of human hearts, in your world as in theirs? If that question stirs something in you, leave a quiet comment below. In the next part of our journey, we will step inside the longhouse to imagine those private scenes. How people negotiated desire and reputation by lamplight, seam by seam, breath by breath. Still, in the messy daily round, people often negotiated. A claimant might accept a payment instead of pressing a harsher sanction. A family could intercede to prevent exile. A powerful ally could silence an accusation. Oral testimony, the tone of a complaint, and the presence of respected witnesses all colored outcomes. The same legal phrase could lead to a public shaming in one valley and a private settlement in another. That variability tells us something important. Law was a resource for communities. Its application depended on human relationships as much as on words. For now, hold the image of the ing place, the cold air, the ledger voice of law. Let it sit beside the softer images you have already gathered. The fur, the fire, the breath of someone sleeping next to you. Both pictures matter. The law pressures society in one direction. Ordinary life pushes back in another. Our task is to listen to both, and to hold the tensions with tenderness rather than judgment. I wake to the smell of peat and the slow, forgiving heat of the hearth. Around me the longhouse breathes. A low chorus of snores, the rustle of a child shifting beneath a woolen blanket, someone stirring porridge in a blackened pot. There is no privacy like the privacy of shared life. When you live close to one another, you learn to read small signals. How someone folds their cloak, the tilt of a head, the way a hand lingers on a bowl. These are the stitches that hold households together. We sleep close because winter asks it of us. The benches are hard, but furs soften them. Shoulders press into shoulders for warmth, and a flame makes a small kingdom of light. In that light, relationships move in quiet ways. A woman who mends cloth beside another woman's lap might rest her fingers longer on a seam. A young man who watches the way someone lights a lamp may feel that pull in his chest the way he feels hunger. In a place where so much is practical, repair, feed, tend, the tender things grow between tasks, soft as moss in the cracks. One evening I remember how the storm insisted on itself, how the wind beat at the eaves and one of the reeds in the roof let loose with a sound like a far-off drum. We gathered round the fire and spoke little. The mood was small and private. Nearby, two companions sat with their backs pressed to the same post, heads bent over a board game carved from bone. They laughed quietly, not for show but for one another. Later, the two slipped a hand beneath the table. The longhouse demands practical alliances. Shared food, shared labor, shared stories. A bond might begin when someone teaches another how to mend a sail, or when two women take charge of the child of an absent father. To sew side by side, to whisper a story while hands move in the same rhythm, is to build intimacy slowly. The smallest comfort, a bowl set within reach, a cloak tucked warmly over knees, becomes proof of care in a world where survival is never certain. We also kept secrets because survival requires them. An accusation in the hall could put a family's future at stake. So lovers learn to be subtle. A cloak left for a particular person, a cup poured just so, a knot tied in a way only one other would notice. I have watched a woman straighten a man's hair with a hand that trembled, then look away as if the movement had been only a kindness. Those tiny gestures become a ledger of love in a place where words could carry too much weight. Gender lines are worn and flexible here. Men take part in weaving at times. Women handle heavy sacks of grain. Both mend and mend again until a rope will hold another season's load. Within these crossings, familiar intimacies form. Two men might share a bed after a long voyage. Two women might keep a hut together when husbands were away. Sometimes what outsiders later label as scandal was an arrangement of necessity and affection, a practical intimacy that also held warmth. It is tempting to force neat categories on such life, but those categories rarely fit. There is also risk tied to these closenesses. A careless word, a joke told loudly at feast, could turn private affection into public scandal. I remember a youth who lived with his cousin and who was mocked for sitting too close to another man. The mockery took a life of its own, then moved to a formal challenge, then to a feud that cost a family a herd and a sister's dowry. The longhouse is a refuge and a theater. What is safe by the fire may not be so in the hall of honor. Yet honor and affection do not always oppose one another. I have seen a household where a chieftain favored his companion, sharing a bed, offering a ring as a sign of trusting ties. That favor did not always weaken his standing. At times it strengthened alliances, cementing loyalty among those who prized the chieftain's judgment. The meaning of a closeness could twist depending on who watched and who benefited. For women, intimacy often finds itself in corners of labor. The dyeing shed, the spinning line, the small window where one can whisper while watching children. Women's friendships can be fierce and tender. I know a healer who kept another woman as a quiet partner. They made ointments together, traded herbs, and held each other through births and losses. Their bond was a kind of mutual insurance. Practical, yes, but also deeply felt. In a culture that speaks chiefly of men in law and saga, these women create a private archive of touch and trust. Listen to the textures. The clack of wooden spoons, the soft thump of wool being carded, the low chorus of a lullaby hummed beside a sleeping child. These sounds are where intimacy often lives. Small, repeated acts build a history between two people in ways that laws and sagas seldom record. A hand that remembers the shape of another's scar. A shared joke that surfaces when cold nights return. The way two people split a loaf and always cut the same ragged edge for one. These are the ledger lines of ordinary love. If you were here, who would you turn to when the storms came? A cousin who can shoulder a sack and tell a good story? A woman who knows how to steady a fevered brow? Imagine the choice not purely of desire, but of trust. In a place where gossip carries and winters are long, comfort often chooses those who are both useful and kind. The heart finds its small freedom within these constraints. Our histories often forget these quiet economies of care. But the longhouse keeps them in the way people move and the way they look at one another. Intimacy in Viking life is not a single label. It is a spectrum, practical, erotic, companionate, protective. Each household arranges its own map. As we sit near the fire, think of those small, ordinary acts. They are the pulses beneath public tales, the soft measures that make a life livable through winter and beyond. I tend the slow-lit corner of the longhouse where women gather at dusk. Each evening the benches fill with hands that know the language of wool and thread, fingers that loop, pull, and knot, eyes that measure by touch. Here, under the low smoke, stories pass between the rhythm of spindle and the glow of embers. This is a place where time softens and the work itself becomes a kind of conversation, where intimacy often grows in plain sight without needing to be named. The historical record, laws, sagas, the odd traveler's note, speaks much less about women's loves than about men's public quarrels. We notice this absence, and in that absence we find a kind of quiet. Silence can erase, but it can also protect. When men wrote laws and told the great hall stories, they had a certain view of what mattered. The workrooms, the sleeping corners, the halves of stories traded among women were not always part of that view. So some loves slept in the shadowed folds of everyday life. Imagine the shed where we dye cloth. The vats steam in a blue mist. Two women stand close, dipping cloth until color takes. Hands are stained in the same deep indigo. The air smells of alder and lye. In such company, bodies grow used to one another's rhythms. The way a shoulder eases forward, the tilt of a head when someone smiles. A joke told across a vat becomes a private joke. A hand offered to steady a slipping pail lingers a measure longer than necessary. These small currents do not shout. They accumulate in the body's memory. There are also the birthing nights, when a healer's lamp is kept low and the longhouse holds its breath. Midwives and healers, who cross households to help bring new life, often become custodians of immense intimacy. Think of the nights spent bent over a woman's pain, of the steadying presence that speaks no louder than a hush. Those nights create a fellowship of trust. Two women who have bargained with death and welcomed a child together know one another in ways unshareable with casual neighbors. When we look for women loving women in the texts, we find hints more than declarations. A saga might note that two women lived together and shared a household, then move on as if the arrangement needed no explanation. Was it convenience? A deep friendship? A partnership beyond what the narrator thought worth mentioning? The silence forces us to imagine possibilities without asserting certainty. That restraint is a kind of historical kindness. It keeps open the space for multiple truths. At times, the absence of official attention has practical consequences. Property, dowries, the right to brew and barter often hinged on a man's recognition. A woman who loved another woman might find her economic security precarious if there were no male kin to voice claims. That vulnerability could shape how openly affections were shown, pushing some to quiet devotion and others to arrangements combining survival with tenderness. Compacts of mutual support, shared plots, joint households. Yet this invisibility sometimes created spaces of freedom. Where fewer eyes recorded every move, women could practice companionship away from the strict policing men faced in public. The spinning shed, the field, the trail to market. These were arenas of both labor and belonging, where companionship could flourish in ways that eluded the hall's sharper gaze. In those margins, affection often looked practical, watching another's child while that woman traded in town, agreeing to take in a sick sister, splitting tasks so each could keep a small store of goods. Practicality and tenderness braided together into durable bonds. We must also consider the language of feeling. The Old Norse vocabulary preserved in sagas offers fewer clear words for female erotic desire than for male shame or honor. That linguistic gap is a barrier but also a mirror. If a culture lacks certain words, it does not make a behavior meaningless. Rather, the behavior is lived in forms that do not always register in written archives. So we read gestures. A name in a poem, a ring left in trust, a promise to tend another's children. These gestures have weight. A promise kept across winters, a ritual shared at a feast, a ring handed over in private. These are the texts of affection we can still touch. In the margins, women kept small archives of feeling. A scrap of cloth embroidered with a secret symbol, a spindle whorl carved with a name, a shared lullaby sung low so only one hears its final line. These objects may seem ordinary to a stranger, but they testify to continuity. Seasons of patience, chains of favors, lifetimes tethered in quiet honor. Oral memory carried weight where ink did not. Mothers passed stories to daughters. Healers taught apprentices names and debts. Neighbors remembered promises. Such traces give us footholds into private worlds otherwise left unspoken and tender secrets. I like to picture a small domestic ritual. Two women who keep a light for one another during midwinter. One brings salted fish and the other brings a length of cured cloth. They share a crust and speak of nothing more than the weather. Yet their glances hold a map of shared history. There is an economy to such scenes. Mutual aid becomes a language of love. Over seasons, the shared labor becomes a promise, not always proclaimed but lived out in countless small acts. There are moments when women's intimacies enter the glare of public life. A woman might be named as a witness, a godmother, a household manager. In rare cases, a woman's close bond might be mentioned in a saga as an important factor. How she guarded a lord's fortune, or stood beside a companion in exile. Such mentions, though few, hint at bonds that could be socially potent even when they escaped full public definition. So often our task as listeners is to be careful, generous, and imaginative. We do not fill every gap with assumption, nor do we refrain from seeing the human possibilities those gaps contain. Have you ever wondered whose voices are missing from history, and how much richer the world might feel if we could hear them? If a silence in a saga calls to you, please leave a note. Tell me which overlooked story you would like to sit with, and together we will try to listen into those quieter corners. Hold now the image of a spinning circle in winter, the hum of whirls, the soft rustle of cloth, the close heat of many bodies bent to the same work. Notice how the light catches hair, how laughter folds into song, how hands learn one another's maps. Those are the quiet archives of women's love, the small objects, gestures, and shared labors that make a life luminous long after the official record falls silent. There is a hush that falls when myth is told by firelight, a hush that makes room for strange and tender possibilities. In the old Norse tales, the gods are not fixed statues but travelers. They change shape, borrow garments, cross thresholds. These narratives give us a world in which identity is porous and play is a kind of thinking. Listen for Loki, who slips between forms with a mischievous cruelty and, in one famous tale, becomes a mare and bears a foal. That image of a trickster god carrying a foal into a hall of men starts a dozen quiet questions about what it means to be other, to be both useful and unsettling. Such stories are not mere jokes. They are experiments in the imagination, ways of handling anxieties about strength, lineage, and the body. When a god changes sex or gives birth, listeners are forced to ask what parenthood, power, and gender might mean. Sometimes the transformation opens a space for acceptance. Shape-shifting characters can be clever and respected despite their oddities. Other times the tale makes the transformation the butt of mockery or the cause of danger. Myth thus holds a double mirror. It reflects both the play of possibility and the sting of social censure. I often return to the practice called seer when thinking of these contradictions. Seer was a form of ritual knowledge, a weaving of fate and perception performed in liminal moments. The practitioners, often women described as volar or seeresses, sat on special stools, sang, and enacted rites that could foretell journeys, calm storms, or shape outcomes for those who sought their counsel. Their authority came from standing between worlds. Their voice operated at a threshold where ordinary speech could not reach. That liminal power felt like a kind of moral electricity, useful, feared, and easily misunderstood. The gendering of seer matters because it shows which powers a society attached to women. When magic is coded as feminine, a man who takes it up may be judged not for skill but for the threat he poses to gender order. The sagas sometimes imply that a man versed in seer could be labeled with the old slur urgi, accused of effeminacy or moral failing. To be called urgi was to have one's masculinity publicly questioned, an accusation that could erode alliances and standing in the hall. The irony is sharp. A craft that might save lives or journeys could also unmake a reputation if performed by the wrong person. Myth takes that irony and magnifies it. A tale might delight in a god who borrows a woman's robe to perform a rite, while a human man doing the same thing invites laughter or scorn. In those contrasts, myth teaches by example and by exception. The gods can play with dress and form precisely because they live outside human obligations. Mortals who imitate them risk real consequences. Yet the very presence of such scenes among the gods shows that the imagination could hold fluid identities, at least at a remove. There is also a pulse of play in these tales that matters. Shapeshifting is not only threat. It can be erotic, comic, or tender. Loki's transformations sometimes serve cruelty, but sometimes they heal or protect. A god who changes shape to aid an ally or to trick an enemy is also a god demonstrating devotion. The form becomes a vehicle for exploring how far one companion will bend to protect another, what might be surrendered or gained in an act of service. Myth teaches that fluidity can be an expression of loyalty as much as of transgression. Ritual and ceremony offer a second lens. Some rites required men of standing to honor female practitioners, to accept counsel from women whose speech could reframe a king's choice. When a chieftain publicly sought a vulva's guidance, he could look wise rather than weak. Context reshaped the same outward act into one of prudent leadership. Conversely, a man who took on a ritual persona for unclear reasons could be ridiculed. In this way, myth and ritual together form a conversation about what society could tolerate and when it would strike. When I trace these threads, I notice how myth often speaks in contrasts. Gods breaking rules, humans policed for doing the same. That tension is instructive because it shows deliberate social negotiation. Myth permits thought experiments. Law and custom seek to enforce outcomes. People lived in the interstice, borrowing the freedom of myth in private while living under communal expectations in public. These stories give language to feelings that might otherwise be unspeakable, or at least allow listeners to rehearse them from a safe distance. Ask yourself gently as you listen, do these myths tell us more about the gods or about the humans who imagine them? For me, the gods are mostly mirrors, shimmering surfaces that reflect a society's curiosities and anxieties. A god who gives birth in an animal's skin or a seeress who knows the turning of the tide teaches us how a people rehearsed difficult questions at arm's length. Through myth, they could test gender, experiment with power, and imagine care in unexpected forms without immediately fracturing communal life. There is a lyric quality to that rehearsal. The myths are not dry. They sing. They give us room to feel tenderness in odd places, a god's brief compassion, a companion's willingness to cross a boundary for friendship. At the same time, they make us aware of cost. Mockery, marginalization, and stigma often shadow such crossings. That ambivalence is itself a kind of honesty. It holds both the warmth of imaginative acceptance and the reality of social constraint. One of the more startling images is the tale of Sleipnir's birth, when Loki, in mare form, carries and gives birth to the swift eight-legged horse that becomes Odin's mount. The story is startling not because it is grotesque, but because it allows listeners to see birth, animal, and trickster folded into a single scene. That tale pulls at the edges of expectation and makes room for awe. It insists that power can come from unexpected forms. I like to end these reflections with a steady thought. Myth teaches through metaphor and music. It does not deliver statutes but possibilities. The Norse imagination used shape and chant to hold complex human realities. Desire, shame, devotion. Close enough to examine, and far enough away to keep the peace. Listening to these stories invites patience and a kinder curiosity toward lives that lived differently. If you would like a single myth read aloud and unpacked slowly, subscribe and we will sit with it together in peace now. I remember the first time I stood at a quay and watched ships from distant waters slide into the harbor, their prows carved in unfamiliar knots and their sails stitched in patterns I had not seen at home. A trader from the south bartered in a language that felt like song. A man who had sailed east spoke of cities where domes shone in the sun. To grow up in a world of voyages is to learn early that identity shifts with the tide. We often picture Vikings boxed by fjords and mead halls, but many of us were travelers, merchants, and settlers. We met people in the slave markets of Constantinople, in the bazaars of the Islamic world, at rivers that traced borders between tongues. Along these routes we encountered customs that folded desire into shapes unfamiliar to our own. A sailor might bring tales of men dancing together at a feast in a far city, or lovers walking openly through a marketplace. Such stories prompted comparison. Some returned appalled, others intrigued. Those encounters did not merely import foreign habits. They changed how people judged their own customs. When a man spoke of tenderness seen abroad, listeners might dismiss it as foreign danger. Or the tale could open a mind to a companionship that made winter less sharp. Travelers' reports in sagas and journals shaped opinions, even when colored by bravado or the need to amuse a hall. Travel reshaped the inward map of longing as much as it altered trade routes. Think of Constantinople, a city of ceremony where our people sometimes served or sold wares. There, practices around companionship and the presentation of the body could strike a Norse eye as both wondrous and strange. Officials moved with ritual, poets praised forms of love that felt ornate to us, and male companionship sometimes showed different public faces. Some men admired such courtly display. Others returned preferring the rougher proofs of honor at home. Farther east, In Islamic cities, markets smelled of spice and parchments carried poems of longing. Poets named desire with a directness that surprised some Norse listeners and comforted others. A caravan camp where people sang of distant lovers could change how a traveler thought of his own private life on return. But such impressions were always mixed with translation, hospitality, and the performance expected of storytellers. Ports loosened boundaries. In a harbor, a person was less anchored to kinship obligations, so partnerships formed more freely. A shipmate and a trader might sleep in the same berth after a storm. Two people might share food and language in a tent that sheltered them from rain. These intimacies could be practical as well as tender. Yet they were precarious. A traveler without family was vulnerable to rumor and exploitation once he returned home. Language itself adapted. Sometimes we borrowed foreign words because our own lacked neat equivalents. Sometimes we bent old words to new meanings. A phrase learned in a distant market might allow a man to name a feeling he had not known before. When tongues meet, maps of desire are redrawn subtly, and private feelings find new words to inhabit. We must read travelers' tales with care. Returnees speak for an audience. They boast, warn, or charm. Their tales are not neutral reports but conversations shaped by pride and need. A man might recount a foreign custom to impress his peers or to justify choices he made abroad. So the stories that reach our halls are filtered, not pure ethnography. Imagine a quiet scene. A trader sits with a companion under a striped awning, sharing spiced bread while the companion teaches him a phrase in a new tongue. The laugh is small and bright. The hand rests easy on a knee. It is not exotic spectacle. It is a private lesson that might mean more to those two than any treaty. If you sailed to another land, how much of your identity would you carry, and how much would you leave behind? Crossings involve choices of survival and belonging. Some returnees kept foreign habits hidden. Others brought home companions who altered households and customs. Sagas tell of foreign spouses, of marriages born of convenience or affection, and of communities that adapted uneasily. Encounters abroad also reshaped honor. In some courts, honor was tied to hospitality and literary skill. In others, to battlefield feats and public strength. A warrior praised in a distant court might return with a taste for different kinds of admiration or might cling more firmly to familiar proofs of manhood. Both responses are human. These crossings made the Norse world porous in ways both dangerous and generous. A voyage could loosen some restraints and tighten others. It could expand a person's language of desire while exposing them to new risks. Imagine standing on a wharf at sunset, the scent of unfamiliar spices in the air, the city lights like stars on the water. You learn a phrase, the touch of a hand, the shape of a new laugh. Those small intimacies travel with you. If a particular foreign place calls to you, Constantinople, Baghdad, or the river towns of Rus, leave a quiet note below. Tell me which crossing you would like to explore next, and we will sit with a traveler's tale together. For now, let the image of foreign sails rest beside your hearthlight. Let the memory of one voyage remind you that who we are can be tenderly altered by what we meet beyond the horizon. Consider those who stood far from home in the emperor's halls, the Varangians who learned court ritual and saw how ceremony reshaped bonds. A guard who watched men move in patterned proximity might return with a different sense of loyalty. Ritual taught that closeness could be public ceremony rather than private scandal. Along eastern rivers, in the towns of the Rus, trade, marriage, and allegiance braided together. Foreign wives and local customs formed new household shapes. Slavery and concubinage complicated intimacy. Captives could become trusted servants, companions, or beloveds. Economic dependency sometimes hid deeper affection. In ports, alliances formed that became lasting attachments, even when social standing made such ties precarious. Desire often traveled alongside goods and coin, threaded through necessity and human feeling. Language and custom adapted. We borrowed phrases for feelings we lacked words for, and sometimes bent old words to new meaning. Returnees told tales shaped by audience and pride, but beneath the boasting lay small facts. A shared meal, a lesson learned, a hand held in a storm. Those threads traveled home with sailors and traders, altering private maps of longing in lasting ways. The fire has settled into an honest glow by now. Outside the night presses the longhouse close, and the wind has hushed into a distant rhythm. We have walked many small rooms of thought together. Sagas and laws, hearthside intimacies, mythic experiments, voyages that carried strangers and new words. Each of these is a thread, thin and human, and when we hold them together they make a small cloth that warms the shoulders of the past. There is comfort in this gentle weaving because it reminds us of a truth historians live with. What survives is partial, and what is missing can be as meaningful as what is kept. A name, a law clause, a stanza in a poem, these are fragments. Between them lie whole lives. We fill those spaces not to invent but to imagine responsibly. We do so with humility, loving curiosity, and respect for the people who will never speak in our own language. If you listen closely, you can hear two kinds of silence. One is the deliberate silence of laws and narratives that turn away from certain intimacies, either because they do not fit the chronicler's purpose or because they were too ordinary to record. The other is the soft silence of tenderness, the small privacy that people guarded because their futures could depend on it. Both silences tell stories, one about control and power, the other about care and survival. We have seen how accusations of shame or urge could be used like arrows to wound a rival's honor. We have also imagined the quiet countersignals. The way hands lingered over sewing, the shared cup left for one particular person, the nursemaid's habit of waking for a specific child. These are not tidy proofs, nor are they less real for being ordinary. Indeed, ordinary acts are often truer than dramatic proclamations, because they are repeated until they become the structure of a life. Thinking about these lives asks us to soften the lines between categories. Words such as taboo or acceptance imply a simple scale, but human life rarely fits a single line. The past contained contradictions. A man could be mocked for certain intimacies and yet be trusted in battle. A woman's household could shelter relationships the hall would never know. Myth could celebrate fluidity at one turn and condemn a similar act at another. Complexity was the norm rather than the exception. Part of our quieter task is to restore dignity to those who would otherwise be footnotes or caricatures. When we name a possible love, a tentative companionship, or a shared bed in a storm, we are not imposing modern identities onto the past. We are acknowledging that people found ways to love and care for one another in forms shaped by their time. That acknowledgement is real, a soft rescue of lives that history almost left behind. There is also consolation in recognizing that uncertainty can be generous. We do not always need to pin a label onto every relationship. Sometimes leaving space for multiple meanings honors the lived complexity better than certainty would. This is not evasiveness. It is ethical restraint. It resists the urge to make the past mirror our present, while still allowing us to be moved by what might have been. As the embers blink and the longhouse exhales, I want to invite a particular kind of listening. Imagine approaching a life with the question, who kept you warm? That question looks for tenderness rather than judgment. It asks about care and trust, about how households formed their small economies of support. If you picture someone in a rough cloak handing you a bowl in a storm, what does that gesture say about love in everyday practice? These are the small answers that matter. Our modern conversations about sexuality and identity have much to teach us, and the past has much to remind us. That practices, words, and judgments change, but the need for connection persists. The Vikings we have imagined tonight were not all the same. They held a range of attitudes and practices that shifted with place, time, and power. Some behaviors were policed. Others found shelter in household routines. When we accept that mixture, we see people more fully. If this journey moved you, please share a thought in the comments. Tell me which small scene you would like to sit with longer. A saga line, a law fragment, a traveler's return, or a woman's spinning shed. Your request helps choose the next quiet hearth we will visit together. And if you have found comfort in these stories, consider subscribing, so that each week another forgotten corner of history can unfold near your evening fire. Now breathe, and let the longhouse sink into sleep. Picture the slow rise and fall of sleeping shoulders, the hush of someone patting a child's back, the quiet contentment in the rhythm of shared breathing. Hold the people we have named tonight gently in your mind, as companions. Before we part, keep two thoughts. First, that silence often carries as much care as speech. And second, that imagining responsibly is an act of compassion. May these small, careful imaginings offer rest. When you are ready, close your eyes and let the warmth of the hearth hold you a while longer. We will meet again by another soft fire, to listen, to imagine, and to remember.